Well, welcome to this evening's session, and we move to Queensland for the presentation tonight by Ben Perkins. It's the 5th of September, 2020. It's just turned spring in the Southern Hemisphere. And tonight we're going to learn about the origins of the Baha'i community in Queensland. Now, Ben has been working on this history for a little while, and it was appropriate that he help us tonight to investigate this subject. And I've invited his father, David Perkins, to give a brief introduction before Ben commences. So David, can I hand over to you?
Hi, everyone. First, I'd like to say Ben is the only member of the extended Perkins family to actually be born in Queensland. So it's entirely appropriate that he look at the Baha'i history of Queensland. He was born in 1996, and at the age of 8, he attended a talk by Dr. Peter Khan at the University of Queensland, which had a profound effect on him. As when he states that he first really got interested in the faith and realized that this great cause was what it was. And that was the first time he started to really investigate it. He'd been born into a Baha'i family. And then he spent a little bit of time back in New South Wales, and then we moved back to Queensland and up to Tully in the remote sort of far north tropics, the wettest town in Australia. So he spent a lot of his life in the rain. And he's academically, he has a degree in chemistry, and he's currently involved in a master's degree in agricultural science, but we're not sure where that's going to lead, so I'll cut that bit short. But yeah, that's basically Benjamin in a nutshell. He absolutely adores history and has always adored anything to do with history. He used to attend with me the 3-year certificate program at Yarrambul, and I would give sessions on the Ministry of the Bab, and he attended all of them as a 3 or 4-year-old and listened to every word and retained it all. And from there, he's had this great interest in the history of the faith. So yeah, that's basically Ben.
Thanks so much for that, David. I couldn't have done an introduction. So Ben, welcome. We look forward to your presentation. I think you can share the screen, and over to you.
Okay, I'll just share the screen and let me know if it's feedbacking, because I've got the TV on in the other room, so hopefully works out. Okay, so that's sharing, so I'll go to present mode. There we go. So it's looking at the Queensland Baha'i history, and unfortunately it's not the whole history, because I sort of was going very meticulously through everything and got a bit distracted. So I got up to about 1953, going through very much in detail, and sort of got stuck there. But I'm hoping we have some of the believers who are around in these times maybe can share a bit at the end, so that we get that first-hand account, which is probably a bit better than what we could get from these documents anyway. I thought I'd start at the end, sort of this is what Queensland, I'll look at it today, just in case I guess we run out of time, at least we look at what it's like today at the start and don't miss out on it. So the Baha'i website says there's 21 local spiritual assemblies in Queensland. Other institutions which assist them are the Regional Council, established in 2001, and the Auxiliary Board. The most recent report said there are about 4,950 people engaged with community building activities, and about 6,200 joined our celebrations of the bicentenary of the birth of the Bab last year. So that's a bit of a quantitative look at the community, but qualitatively, there's also a warm community atmosphere, a lot of youth engagement through all these core activities and firesides deepenings, all of these things. And this is a photo of the 2013 youth conference that they held in Brisbane. So I guess a look at the modern history and where we're at now. And then we'll go back now and look at the very early days. I thought a good way to start is really know that the faith came to Australia in the 1920s. And it's always interesting, I think, to try and look at the history, not so much in a vacuum of what the Baha'is were doing, but also getting that wider context, because I think you get more insights even to what the Baha'is were doing by doing that. So this is where Queensland was in 1921. That was the census was in Australia. So Queensland only had about 568,000 people, majority male. About 35% of the population was in Brisbane. this presentation is going to be very focused on Brisbane because you can see most of the people were living there. So understandably, most of the Baha'i activity was also there. It's also interesting, I think, to look at the spiritual makeup of Brisbane in the 1920s to get a sense of the atmosphere the Dunns were sort of coming into. I took the one in italics down the bottom. They're in italics because the ones above it were listed in the Pocket Brisbane Guide for 1921. So that's the document, I guess, people looked at if they wanted to visit Brisbane, sort of a touristy thing. It lists a lot of different churches, also a Jewish synagogue and a Theosophical Society. And the two in italics at the bottom aren't in that pocket guide, but they were present, which was actually a mosque established in 1909, and a Unity Truth Center, which is sort of a new age, new Christian thought type of group. So it's interesting that they're sort of on the outer, they're not something the community was celebrating, but you did have a lot of these different types of Christian groups. And then there's obviously some photos of Brisbane in around 1921. Yeah. So in terms of my approach to the history, just so you know what I'm basing it on in case I leave anything out. So up to the 1940s, we didn't really have institutional development in Queensland. So it's really relying on Grove, which has just newspapers and things, historical documents and wider community records. In the 1940s, we sort of had an LSA and we started contributing to the Baha'i Bulletin, so you can get information from there. Mel Heggie also wrote a wonderful book where she recounts really the story of how the Brisbane LSA was established. In the 1950s and beyond, which I haven't really done any of, obviously going to the Bulletin again, and hopefully first-hand accounts, but I've been a bit shy to sort of ask people about it, so I haven't got too much of that yet. So you'll notice at the start I said 1892 to 1953, not 1920. So it's interesting to think about how did we have a high faith in Queensland in 1892. I've put a note here to thank Stephen Collins, who's here, because it's really, he does a wonderful job of going through all the American newspapers and collecting all of these details. So I never would have known this. I basically just ripped off what he'd written up. So it's his research, but it's actually Dr. George Buchanan, who was a Presbyterian priest. He moved to Australia in 1883 to serve as a priest, and he was a bit controversial. He sort of stirred people up a bit while he was here. He doesn't look very controversial, I suppose, but I think this is when he was older. So when he was younger, it was a bit more exciting, I guess. So this is just a newspaper article, sort of going through a talk that he gave. So I'm not sure how much time, I haven't timed the talk, so I might not read all the way through it. But he's basically saying in this talk that he thinks the church has become too stuck on these dogmatic principles and like the ceremony, and he's saying we just need to go back to the life of Christ. So I guess it gives you a sense of what his engagement with Christianity was. He was very sort of spiritual, focused on the teachings, not so much on the church doctrine, which, as you can imagine, as a priest, that would make him quite controversial. He first discovered the faith because he went to an Presbyterian conference in England, and on the way back he thought, well, I'll visit the Holy Land, visit the holy sites of Christianity. And that was in 1892, around the time of the ascension of Baha'u'llah. So he actually discovered the faith during that visit to the Holy Land. And there's not really much mention of the faith while he was in Australia after that. He did move to South Africa. And we know, because the pioneers that went to South Africa, Fanny Knobloch, I believe, and that a lot of people actually knew about the faith because he was speaking about it in his sermons and his talks. But possibly would have done the same thing in Australia. We just didn't know about it. And he eventually moved back to the United States in 1908, and he got into contact with the Baha'i community there. And while declaration wasn't sort of a formal procedure in those days, he did write to Abdu'l-Baha, and he received a tablet. So this is from the Star of the West, just a provisional translation. Abdu'l-Baha said to him, I ask God that you may learn all these verses in the Holy Book, which refer to Haifa and Akka, and quote them in your addresses. It's quite interesting. While declaration wasn't a formal procedure, nobody signed a card way back in these early days. Sort of the process was you would write to Abdu'l-Baha, declaring your faith, and receive a tablet. But in a sense, thinking about first Queensland Baha'i, I mean, he discovered the faith in 1892, was in Australia for a couple of years in Queensland, so perhaps he fits the bill. So that's not a nice sort of declared on this date kind of a thing, but it is like he was passionate about the faith and eventually associated with the Baha'i community in America. That's quite interesting, I think, this idea that the faith wasn't really contained, even though the Baha'is were. So all the Baha'is were sort of in America and the Middle East, but the faith was getting out. You couldn't keep it a secret. Another one of these early stirrings was Robert Stewart. So he was a dentist in Brisbane, and he actually first heard of the faith because he read an article in the London Times about Abdul Baha's visit to London. And in 1912, he met a reverend called H. Price, heard a bit more, and decided, that's it, I believe in Baha'u'llah. So again, another possible first Queensland Baha'i candidate. I haven't found anything about this Reverend H. Price at all. My speculation is maybe he heard about the faith from George Buchanan, but I don't know that for sure. Robert Stewart thought of himself as a Baha'i, but he didn't actually associate with the community until 1946, because you imagine 1912, where is he going to find another Baha'i to talk to in Australia? And he remained a part of the Baha'i community into the 60s, because I spoke to Anne Stark, who lived in Brisbane in the 1960s as a child, and she says she remembers him. He was very well dressed. His favorite holy day was the birth of the Bab, and he would jokingly refer to himself as a Babi, which I'm sure people remember. William Sears kind of did the same thing, was very touched by the story of the Bab and very attached to that part of the history. So another early stirring. Yet another one is Dr. Jacob Bean. So he was very prominent in the Theosophy movement. His family's quite famous. His brother wrote a lot about the World War I and the Anzacs, Charles Bean. And so he was very closely associated with the Baha'is in the 1940s. He wrote a book called A Comparison and Contrast of Theosophy with the Baha'i Faith, actually while he was staying in Brisbane in 1949. But I'd say that's almost certainly the first Baha'i book published in Queensland, all the way back in 1949. Although he did ultimately remain a theosophist when they explained that the Baha'i faith is independent character, so you can't really be an active member of other spiritual groups. He chose to remain with theosophy. The interesting part is in 1923, he visited the Toowoomba Theosophical Society, and he gave a talk where he mentioned the Baha'i faith. I've just put it there, that's from the publication of the talk. This was before Hyde Dunn had visited Queensland. So there was somebody speaking about the faith, beat him to the punch, as it were. So he's got some of the facts are not correct in his talk, because obviously you didn't have Wikipedia or Bahaipedia or these things to double check. But he speaks very highly of it, and very positively about it, and sort of says Abdul Baha was knighted as some of the basic facts. I guess you could say he proclaimed the faith all the way back in 1923 in Toowoomba. Another early stirring before, I guess, the official date of when the Baha'i faith came to Queensland. Very interesting, I think, always these parts of the history where it's like the faith was kind of getting out and spreading, even without the Baha'i sort of doing anything. Obviously, then when the story really picks up in terms of the sort of firm establishment of the community, is Hyde and Clara Dunn, who I'm sure I've heard a lot about in the centenary here. I've just included this because I was quite happy I found this picture on Trove, because as we know, Hyde was a traveling salesman for the Bacchus Marsh Milk Company. And this is just a photo of one of the setups, which I included to show the youth when I gave a talk about Brisbane history, but kind of interesting to see, I think. At least it was interesting for me. That's sort of what the general pattern is. Clara would stay in the city, Hyde would go out to the little towns, and Hyde would sort of speak, and Clara would build those friendships. But I'm sure you've heard more about that from people like Dr. Hassel. But in terms of first Queensland Baha'i, we've looked at some people who sort of had early stirrings where there wasn't an official declaration process. In terms of the first official Baha'i, if you like, Good was the first to sign the card and sort of engage, not properly, but formally with the faith. So he heard Hyde Dunn speak when he was 17 years old in 1924, which I was a bit confused about because Hyde Dunn didn't visit Queensland until 1926. But I found out his aunt was a Baha'i who lived in Sydney. So my pure speculation guess is he probably went down to Sydney with his mother to visit his aunt or something. I heard Hyde Dunn speak there. He served as a contact point for the Baha'is in Brisbane throughout the 1930s. The lack of administrative development meant he couldn't really formally declare until 1942, just because I imagine it's a very long trip to get all the way down to Sydney from Queensland. So how is he going to do it? But it wasn't until 1942, even though obviously he was very engaged with the faith before that. And he was quite prominent in Queensland. He was the vice president of the bread manufacturers of Queensland. He was very prominent in the baking community. And he was also prominent in the local Baha'i community and was first chairman of the LSA. And so something which is really fascinating, I thought, because his family was quite prominent, they were one of the first bakers in Brisbane, actually have a park where the family bakery used to be called Good Park, named after his family. And this is sort of the address that was published in Baha'i World. If you wanted to get in touch with the Brisbane Baha'is, it was this area, which is now this park. So it's quite fascinating if you look where the current Baha'i Centre in Brisbane is. It's only a 2-minute drive. It's like right up the street from it. So the Baha'i Centre in Brisbane has sort of moved around. The Baha'is have been in different places. It's quite remarkable that it's almost like it's come back home to where it was all the way back in the 1930s, and landed almost in the exact same place. This is, I'm sure there's reasons for it, but it was got like sort of chills down the spine moment looking it up. Where is it? It's just up the street. So that's sort of these early stirrings of people discovering the faith elsewhere, or maybe discovering it not through Baha'is. I guess where it really began in earnest was obviously through the Dunns. And so this is just a letter that John Esselmont, Secretary of the Guardian, to Hyde Dunn, conveying the Guardian's wishes. So it says, "We hope and pray that the way may be opened up for you to visit Brisbane this year, to revisit all the centres where you have already sown the seed." Obviously, the Guardian wanted the faith firmly established in all the capital cities of Australia, just to ensure it didn't get too focused in one particular state as the Baha'i state, that kind of thing, I imagine. It was encouraging Hyde Dunn, make sure you visit Brisbane as well. And I love this photo of the Guardian, obviously, with Dr. Esselmont, before he was the Guardian. It's a wonderful photo. So this is just some key dates. So in November 1925, so he got the letter in 1925. I imagine it was quite prompt to do what the Guardian had asked him. So he left Sydney for Brisbane, and he visited all the towns en route. So he didn't waste his journey. Wherever he was, he would be teaching the faith. So he didn't just visit Brisbane. He also went up to Cairns and Townsville. During February, he was actually living in Townsville. And in April, he visited Bundaberg, Rockhampton, and Maryborough. In 1926, he went back down to Sydney. And this is a photograph of the Bundaberg Grand Hotel, which is where he was staying. And I think it's quite interesting. You see, it's quite Wild West Queensland in those days. It looks sort of like a spaghetti Western town. And this is from about the year when Hyde would have been staying there and visiting. So it gives us a sense of what it would have looked like when he was walking around teaching the faith. So they went back for a second visit after going back down to Sydney. During this second visit, Clara came with him, and Hyde visited Cairns for a month during this. Rented a flat which was called Le Jardin. I couldn't find a picture of it, but I did find this description of it, which is quite interesting. It describes it as one of the oldest structures in South Brisbane, and it had this sort of grove of trees and stuff. I guess quite a beautiful place, and they also held meetings there. That's quite an interesting, I think, description, just in terms of getting that sense of what it would have been like to be there in the moment. And so in August, he also visited Western Queensland, and in November, they departed Queensland. The trouble is, of course, there wasn't a bulletin, so there was no one sort of writing articles about this. So I'm not sure, I haven't personally been able to find much sort of details about what would have been doing specifically. So maybe it's a bit dry, but I apologize for that, but at least there's the dates. And so this is when Hyde Dunn was in Brisbane. I found a few newspaper advertisements of his talks, which he gave. So he spoke at the Unity Truth Centre, which we mentioned at the start. And so Unity Truth Centre, you think that sounds very Baha'i, Unity, we love that. And so what it actually was with the Unity Christian movement, which was established, I think, by Charles Fillmore in the 1880s. And you can read more about that, I guess. We don't need to spend too much time on it, but quite an interesting movement that has some interesting books. And also the Theosophical Society, which is another sort of new thought movement, very open-minded about things. They wouldn't get upset at anything he said, really. He could be quite correct. Which we can see by the titles of his talk. So his one at the Unity Truth Centre was Divine Plan of the Ages. In terms of direct teaching, it doesn't get more direct than his Theosophical Society talk called Baha'i Movement, Its Teaching and Its Universality. Quite direct and to the point, I guess. And obviously this is just a photo of where the Unity Truth Centre was. I think it was more a room inside this big building, but they called it a centre. And so I found this very interesting. He wrote a letter to somebody in Adelaide about the faith who was interested, and that person sent it to the newspaper and said, here, publish this. This is pretty interesting, this guy talking about the faith. And it's interesting because it's sort of, I think, a glimpse of how he might have talked, how he might have spoken about the faith. This is not a talk from Brisbane, but it's sort of It's just something he wrote in a letter to teach the faith to someone. It's saying, Australia, with its industrial difficulties and racial differences, is ripe for such a message. It will awaken her to realize that we are all the drops of one ocean and the leaves of one tree, created to live in peace and freedom, acquire the perfections and virtues of God. This is the real spiritual life. Characterize our lives with the divine characteristics. These are the qualities of the heart. The education of the future will be the development of these high attributes, which will elevate man into the image of God, which he was created, to know his creator and make his love and beauty known among the people of this material world. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the metaphor of when you're teaching the faith, you want to be like the hollow reed and give them in its purest form. And I think it's quite remarkable. He's not quoting any writings verbatim here. It's amazing how much of a hollow reed he's being with these words. It's very direct to what you see in the writings. It's also interesting he talks about the education of the future. I thought that was quite considering, obviously, current cycle of plans were very focused on education and this idea of teaching these virtues and characteristics. I don't know, hopefully that was a bit interesting. That's maybe what it would have been like to sit in one of his talks back in the 1920s in Brisbane or anywhere else. So in terms of what he was doing other than giving talks, he actually spoke to a lot of contacts who were in Queensland who had seen elsewhere. So somebody who moved around the time that Hyde was there, which is a bit interesting, I thought, is Ron Cover, his wife Irene Cover. So he was actually Hyde's manager in Adelaide. And he moved to Brisbane in 1927, so they became Bahais in Adelaide. And then they lost touch with the community until his wife reconnected in 1940. I think their son was a Baha'i. Just in terms of, I guess, the challenges also, is you teach people the faith, but then you don't have Facebook, you don't have an email address, so how do you keep in touch when they move to the other side of the country? It was, yeah, reconnecting with contacts he'd found elsewhere, and then obviously difficult to keep up that contact once left Queensland, just because of the tyranny of distance. In terms of trying to find a bit more character, I guess, to give to write up of the history, so it's not just dates and on this date they had this meeting, that kind of thing. I actually wrote to the World Centre to say, do you have any letters or reports? And I thought this was quite interesting because they wrote back and said that anything somebody writes to the head of the faith is actually confidential. Which I guess is quite reassuring in terms of if we have questions about something, if we write it to the Universal House of Justice, that's never going to be published. So even in 100 years, nobody's going to go and pour through, what was this person asking? So it's like we do have that kind of privacy when we're addressing questions about personal matters. But they did write up a summary of what was in the letter, so they couldn't send the letters themselves. So this is a letter Hyde wrote to the Guardian in 1927, sort of after he'd finished the first couple of visits. It says, Hyde states that he and Clara Dunn travelled to the state capitals of Australia, the last one being Brisbane, Queensland. He writes that whilst in Brisbane, they resided, I'm just going to move the people's faces that are sitting over the top. Whilst in Brisbane, they resided in a flat and hosted gatherings for friends and those investigating the faith. He notes that great interest was shown by a few of these individuals, resulting in Clara forming a study class with the aim that it would continue following the departure and later result in the establishment of an assembly. So this idea of establishing study classes, I think is a bit interesting. They're quite similar to what the youth and people are sort of doing today. It's sort of doing the same thing. Maybe the material is different, but it's find people, if they're interested, try and establish a study class so they can kind of deepen their understanding and do something practical with it. And so in terms of what these study classes were like, he conveys that in the smaller centres, a few people are investigating the teachings of the study of Dr. Esselmont's books, along with other books and tablets. And then he talks about how he's going to go to Perth. The other thing the Guardian said is make sure you're going to all of these places you've sown the seeds and cultivating his relationship. And this is just a photo. I think this is the first edition of Baha'u'llah in the New Era, which is what Dr. Esselmont's book is. So this is, I guess, what it would have looked like when everyone was sitting down reading through it. Well, interesting connection. This is sort of in reply to that 1927 letter Hyde sent to the Guardian. Paul Rosenberg, who was another believer who served as his secretary, she wrote this in response, saying that she was surprised to hear he was in Rockhampton because her brother had lived in Rockhampton for 3 years after he graduated from Cambridge. I don't think her brother was a Baha'i, but it's interesting these connections. You think, how has somebody in Haifa got anything to do with Queensland? But then there's a connection. It's, oh, my brother was in that town. And I think even today when you talk to Baha'is in a setting like this of people all over the world, you find these weird connections and people who've been in places you've been, that kind of thing. It's sort of just an interesting side note. We went back a third time in 1928, and actually during this visit, an assembly was established. But it's important to remember, so Hyde Dunn left America to pioneer in about 1920. So when he left America, if you read Robert Stockland's books, assembly was actually sort of a general term for a community. They had boards of council, executive boards, all these different names, but assembly was sort of just the community as a whole. So the Brisbane Assembly was sort of the same thing. It wasn't like a 9-member body as we understand it today. And in reality, it was sort of more a group of interested people, not necessarily committed Baha'is who wanted to have an assembly, that sort of thing. But during this visit, Hyde and Clara both went again, stayed in New Farm. Clara this time actually gave a talk herself at the Unity Truth Centre. And they later stayed at the Hotel St. Bernard in Mount Tambourine. There's an LSA in Mount Tambourine today. It's one of those 21 we talked about at the start. And then by October, they'd left Queensland, so it was a bit of a shorter visit. And this is just a photo of the Hotel St. Bernard at the time when they would have stayed there. Yeah. There's not many photographs of this time of the Dunns in Queensland, so I sort of tried to make it a bit interesting by doing photos of the places. But unfortunately, they're not in it. But this is just some clippings about that visit. So again, we have the titles of the talks, which I think is always interesting. Bahai gave a talk about evolution as a scientific proof of the existence of God. Been quite remarkable for the 20s. And Clara Dunn gave a talk on our prophets and how we receive them. And the photo on the right is just of Ann Street. Because the Theosophical Society was on this street, I couldn't find a specific photo of number 59. It would have been one of the buildings along the street, and this is sort of what the street would have looked like at the time. So, sort of the very rough pioneering part of the faith of going out and travel teaching. And okay, so yeah, Queensland looked quite Wild West appropriately. After that, obviously, you go out and teach, you find interested people. But then we also want to have a community with a bit of structure so that we can achieve things and helping and social action, all of these things. One of the people who was very instrumental in assisting the Baha'i community to do that was Keith Ransom Keller, who was named a Hand of the Cause posthumously, and also a martyr because she passed away in Iran of smallpox. So she was named a martyr for doing that and going to Iran. And sort of one of the things she did was sort of deepen the community on these administrative principles that Shoghi Effendi was establishing for us to help us function as a community. So in 1931, she did that in Australia. And so she was, I get a bit surprised to find that a lot of the Australian Baha'i community, they didn't really know that much about the faith, which is not surprising when you think about it. We didn't have a printing press or anything, so it was quite limited the amount of writings you could get. I know Percy Ullman, the first Baha'i in Adelaide, the first actual book he got was from Keith Ransom Keller in this 1931 visit. So it was quite difficult for people to kind of deepen their understanding and study beyond Baha'u'llah and the New Era and some basic information. And a lot of them were still attending church or members of groups like the Theosophical Society. And when she told them sort of, this is an independent religion, it has sort of requirements on membership, a lot of them lost interest because they thought of it as, oh, it's another New Thought movement. It was a bit disappointing at the time, but not that big of a deal, I suppose, because they were sort of just receptive and interested. And that a bit more, weren't so interested. It's interesting, it was reported in the newspaper in Brisbane when she visited. It was sort of, I guess, a big deal to have an American coming to Brisbane, so there was a bit of proclamation there, talking about the faith. The fact she was in Queensland from America. And so in Baha'i World Volume 5, a Baha'i called Bertram wrote up a report of a visit, which gives us sort of a sense of her impressions of the Baha'i community. It says, all groups are consistently increasing their numbers and widening their activities, especially Adelaide, Sydney, and Auckland. In the cases of Melbourne, Brisbane, and Perth, the progress has been much less spectacular. So we weren't doing so well. Melbourne and Perth are stuck with us sort of at the bottom of the list. It is nice, I guess she describes it as less spectacular. She doesn't say it's bad or we're not doing so well. So still positively framed, which is always encouraging. And then she also goes on to say this, which I think is always important to bear in mind. There's little to report, but the progress made when expressed in spiritual values is quite as important as that of the larger group. So obviously we keep track of the statistics and stuff, but don't get too focused on that. It is about the spirituality as well. So one of the positive things she said about the Brisbane community is that even though it's only a group, it does have young Baha'is, because if you look at old photos of the national conventions, it sort of is very much older ladies. So you just say at least Brisbane has some young people, which would have been Jack Good. He was in his 20s, so a bit younger than, I guess, the typical Australian Baha'i of the time. So the one positive thing to say. In terms of further reading, I think a lot of people would have already read this book, but if not, it's a very great book, which has some funny anecdotes about Keith's time working with the Dunns, and well worth reading, just to get that sense of the story and more narrative style than just the dates, that kind of thing. In terms of the aftermath of this visit, when she sort of went and told people, okay, to be a Baha'i, you do have to do this. You have to not go to church, these kinds of things. A lot of the communities kind of closed up shop a bit. So there was not much Baha'i activity in Brisbane at all during the 1930s. However, Jack Good did keep putting his address in the Baha'i world. So I've circled it there. You can see he was putting his address to say, if you want to send me stuff, I suppose. In terms of thinking about, well, if he was a Baha'i and he believes in the faith, why did he not sort of do anything about it? Essentially, I think it's just looking at the biographical details. So in 1932, he got married. He had a kid in 1936. And his dad passed away in 1937, so he had to take over the bakery. But sort of like he was kind of the only Baha'i living in Brisbane and knew about the community. He had a lot of stuff going on, so it wasn't, I guess, realistic to expect him to establish a community when, one, he didn't know that much about it in the first place. And also he had all of these personal life getting in the way of the spiritual. The 1930s was a bit, I guess what's the word for it? A bit inactive, a bit on pause. But in 1941, when the National Spiritual Assembly was kind of getting a bit more firmly established, they said, okay, we need to do something about Brisbane and kind of get its act together and make sure we're supporting it. So they organized a teaching campaign, which in terms of thinking about eras of the faith, this is quite representative of a change in era, because this was a formally organized campaign as opposed to the individual initiative of Hyde Dunn kind of just going, oh, well, I'll go and teach people. So this was a bit more systematic, a bit more planned out with a team and consultation and these things. So it was an all-woman teaching team. Quite interesting for the 40s that it was all women kind of doing the work. And so Hilda Brooks was the speaker of the group, and going with her was Charlotte Moffat and her sister, Hilda Brooks' sister, Rose Hawthorne, who was sort of more support, collecting people's contact details at the end of the talk and seeing them throughout the week, those kinds of things. And so in terms of Hilda Brooks, she was a very talented public speaker. She'd actually accompanied Martha Root when she visited Australia a few years before this. So sort of learnt from best in terms of how to speak about the faith in those settings. This is Hilda Brooks. This is again from that research department memoranda they sent me when I wrote to the World Centre. They describe a letter that Hilda wrote. It says, the National Assembly Secretary, Hilda Brooks, shares with The Guardian. In accordance with the Assembly's Teaching Committee's plans, she and her sister, Mrs. Hawthorne, plan to travel next May to Brisbane, Queensland. She states that challenges are expected as there are no Baha'is there. They only hold a few addresses of people they have never met before. I imagine it quite daunting to go up to the deep north, this kind of rugged state where you don't know anybody, you just have some addresses. Are they going to be interested? Would have been quite daunting as a bunch of sort of women in this time to do that. It's also interesting that she says there are no Baha'is there, because Good certainly considered himself a Baha'i. So it's interesting looking at that tyranny of distance and trouble with communication. So he thought he was a Baha'i, but they didn't know about him. So this pretty big problem we don't have to worry about anymore, of just, do we know who's where? Anyway, there was another cable sent on behalf of The Guardian in response to that. There's the contemplated teaching trip of Miss Brooks, Mrs. Hawthorne and Mrs. Moffat to Queensland meets with The Guardian's wholehearted approval. will pray in the holy shrines that its outcome will be richly blessed and fruitful. It's quite interesting to think the Guardian was taking care of the whole Baha'i world. And yet he was aware and praying for this teaching campaign just to some little rural state in Australia. And so Hilda Brooks obviously was the National Assembly Secretary. And so Chogi Effendi wrote a cable to the NSA, and it took a while for them to get back to him. And Hilda Brooks explained it's because I'm in Brisbane. And so the Guardian replied personally, not through his secretary, saying, "Work Brisbane, love Chogi Rabbani." It's interesting, obviously, the Guardian saying personally in his own words that he was praying for this campaign. And I suppose one of the, obviously we're not superstitious, but one of the interesting things, the Guardian was praying for this campaign, is that as soon as they arrived, they're thinking, we don't know anybody, we just have a few addresses, what are we going to do? This man, his name was O'Brien Hoare, he was a bit of an eccentric speaking coach and poet. He has a lot of ads in the paper about his accomplishments and, oh, come and I'll teach you how to speak. A bit of a local personality. Somehow found out they were coming through one of his contracts, and he just approached them and said, yeah, I'm on board, I'm going to help you, here's where you can organize your lectures, here's some people that will be interested. So he didn't become a Baha'i, but for whatever reason, he just decided, I'm going to take these women under my wing and help them run this teaching campaign. So you see the Guardians praying, and they just get this local assistant to kind of help them do stuff out of the blue. It's quite a remarkable occurrence to happen. And there's a picture of him. So Hilda's first talk was at the Country Women's Association rooms, and it was attended by 60 people. I received a lot of positive newspaper articles. She also returned to the Theosophical Society, where obviously Hyde had they've established a bit of a relationship. And that's just a picture of the hotel where they were staying. I'm not sure, I haven't found any records of how many people went to Hyde Dunn's talk, so I'm not sure more receptivity or less receptivity. I guess in terms of first numbers that I've been able to find, it was in 1941, they did get 60 people to come to a talk. And so as a follow-up to that, she also got an interview in the Queensland Country Life. This is just a picture of the top of it, but it was quite a big half-page spread where she was talking about the role women were going to play in society. I think, people were quite impressed by that. And so while they were doing this teaching campaign, she was giving talks quite regularly. They actually ran out of the books that they had, the literature to give out, and they had to write back and say, okay, we need 2 more crates of books to give out because they're flying off the shelves kind of thing. The interesting thing about that development from individual initiative to now systematic under the NSA, Hyde Dunn probably would not have been able to do that and get more books sent to him. He was the only person sort of in Australia doing that. This time they ran out of books, but the NSA was able to support and send more books. You see that progression from kind of individual initiative to more systematic efforts. So Hilda had to depart in June. Olive Jane Routh, who was an English Baha'i who'd pioneered to Australia, she used to help the Dunns run Dawnbreakers classes, I believe, in Sydney. So she came to Brisbane to take over and give the talks, and Charlotte Moffat also stayed on to help with the support work. They managed 7 weeks of intensive teaching, of sort of constantly giving talks, constantly following up with people who were interested and building those bonds of genuine friendship. For 7 weeks might not sound that long, but I'm sure anyone who's tried to do one of these intense kind of teaching activities knows it is quite difficult to keep that up over that amount of time, kind of constantly thinking about just teaching. So quite remarkable achievement, really. And so in response to this teaching campaign, the Guardian sent a follow-up cable saying, the response to your teaching work met with in Brisbane is truly most encouraging and shows a remarkable receptivity on the part of the people of Australia for the divine message. Chogi Effendi hopes that you will be able to undertake many such trips in furtherance of the teaching work, and that an increasing number of the friends will do likewise. So it's essentially always the Guardian saying, good job, but then encouraging, you can do more. And in 1942, I sent another cable regarding Brisbane saying the Guardian was very happy to know that the work in Brisbane is progressing, the cause is more and more coming before the public and reaching the attention of prominent people. It feels the believers must continue to do their utmost to acquaint their fellow citizens with the teachings, that they may hear of them even if they don't accept them. Which is quite an interesting concept, is saying it doesn't really matter if they become a Baha'i or not, but just let them know about it, because maybe they'll be interested, maybe they won't, that's okay as well. Because obviously in the faith we have this concept that we don't proselytize. So even we're talking about teaching campaigns and giving talks, these kinds of things, it's always with this in mind of just making sure people are hearing about it. That's it. If they're interested, teach more, but not kind of going beyond just letting them know about it, which you see reflected in this letter from the Guardian. In terms of the tangible results of this teaching campaign, they established a study group. So now we have study circles. In those days, they still had that sort of thing, but they had a study group where you imagine they were reading stuff like Baha'u'llah in the New Era. Jack Bedgood was elected chairman of that study group, so he was still very involved. Oswald Whitaker, the first Australian Baha'i, actually visited Brisbane to help and support, so they weren't kind of left off in the wilderness. And James Heggie, who at this time, I believe, was in the army and stationed in PNG, when he was on leave, he came down to Brisbane. He gave talks to the study group, and he'll pop up later in this talk. I'm sure people know about his time in Queensland. However, by 1943, the study group had stopped meeting. It kind of had fallen apart a bit, which you imagine with no deepened teacher there to kind of encourage people and make sure they're getting answers to their questions. It's quite hard to keep up that enthusiasm. However, one achievement was that Jack Bedgood officially declare in 1942 the first Queenslander to sort of sign the declaration card. You can see that kind of erection of the administrative order happening, where at least someone was aware of the importance of the declaration, even if the study group didn't stick, the teaching work didn't stick that well. Obviously, the NSA didn't just give up. So they had a goal of establishing a travel teacher to visit for an extended period, and also a long-term pioneer in October 1943. And so Clara Dunn, who at this time was becoming quite old, she was relatively old when she came to Australia. You think maybe she'd fine to kind of retire and be the venerable Baha'i at the meetings, but no, she signed up and said, I'll go to Brisbane, and she pioneered to Brisbane for 6 months. There was also a young woman who offered to pioneer, and Jack Bedgood actually set up a job for her, but ultimately she wasn't able to make that step. Interesting to see how, Jack Bedgood was very involved in the teaching work as well, and supporting it. And the hand of the cause, the hand of the cause at this time, but future hand of the cause, pioneering herself to assist this far-flung outpost. And so she got this encouragement from the Guardian to Clara Dunn, saying, your letter on August 23rd reached the Guardian, and he greatly rejoiced to hear of your determination to arise and serve the faith in Queensland during the last year of the first Baha'i century. And then she had also the personal postscript saying, may the beloved of our hearts graciously assist, protect, sustain, and help you always and enable you in the all-important teaching field to win fresh laurels for the crown you have won in his service. Quite a lovely poetic words of encouragement for her. She stayed for about 6 months. Annie Bedgood, who was Jack Bedgood's mother, also declared. Jack Bedgood later said in an interview that she thought of herself as a Baha'i from the same time he did, but I guess she didn't declare when he declared. She declared a bit later through Clara Dunn's visit. I don't know any of the details. And it's interesting that the Brisbane community showed some signs of self-sustainability, of not necessarily needing so much support from southern communities, because there were 2 declarations in 1945 when Clara Dunn wasn't there. But both of them lost touch with the community quite quickly. One was from Brisbane, one was from Swan Creek. Making those early strides to kind of having their own community, but not quite there yet, I suppose, in terms of the consolidation. So that was 1945, maybe again not going so great. So in 1946, the NSA asked Greta Lapprell, who we heard a lot about in the Tasmania session. She was the first Tasmanian Baha'i. They asked her, can you go and help this work? So quite interesting to see how much it was really women establishing this faith in Queensland, even though at the start we saw that in the 20s, Queensland was sort of mostly men. So she stayed for 3 months, again, an extended period, not just a couple of weeks. She wrote an extremely detailed report on her visit to the Bulletin when she left. So we do know, well, I know quite a bit about what she was doing, because she was organized enough to really write it up and document it. She used a lot of methods in terms of expansion methods. How do we meet people? So she would just start conversations at cafes or while she was catching a bus. She also gave the informal talks thing. Other places she visited was the Esperanto Society. Even just seeing whatever sticks, she just contacted the Lord Mayor of Brisbane. So see, are you interested in this? And she was really quite, she did not get discouraged by anything not going right. So she booked town hall to give a talk, and nobody showed up at all. So that's quite an upsetting thing. We put together this meeting, no one's here. She just started speaking to the staff at the town hall, like the people at the front desk. It's like, well, do they want to hear about the faith? So really irrepressible spirit. And in terms of reflecting, she didn't just go, oh, well, this didn't work. I guess, I don't know what happened. She was active in her reflections and said, well, maybe the newspapers aren't so good. So she said to the NSA, future people, maybe use the radio will be a bit more effective. Really using the one perspective of failure as a learning experience to assist the people in the future, not to have the same thing happen, which is easy to take for granted, I think, doing that. Also interesting in terms of reflecting, because as we've seen with the previous campaigns, there was always this receptivity in Brisbane. They could get people to the meetings, could get the study groups going. What's stopping people from accepting the faith? What's the stumbling block? She discovered through talking to the contacts that a lot of people had this misconception that the Bahais believed Baha'u'llah was God in the flesh, sort of God on earth, which I found quite interesting. I know that it's been a problem for believers in the East. Somehow it also cropped up here in the West. So she addressed this by giving a deepening on the Kitabi Khan, explaining the concept of the manifestation of God and how that's really distinct from this idea of God in the flesh. You think if she hadn't have done that and had those conversations, maybe we'd still be teaching and wondering, well, what's everybody's problem with the faith? But no, she went and identified, okay, there must be a reason these people are receptive, but aren't declaring and kind of engaging more beyond that this level of interest. Another one of the things she noticed in terms of helping the community set up itself, she noticed Jack Good. So we've been putting his address in the Baha'i world, which went to the entire world for all these years. You notice he had a very large collection of books. He said, why don't you establish a lending library and start lending these books to people? You have this great collection. So he did that, and sort of we had the first Baha'i library of Brisbane. And so I'm volunteering in the library at the Baha'i Centre now, and there's a lot of these first edition texts from the 30s and 40s, which are actually from his collection. It's quite nice, I think, that his library all the way back from 1946, it's really still in use today, and it's still something the community can draw on. It's quite an enduring legacy. And this is just the portrait of him. It's in the library today. It's not a great picture. I couldn't figure out how to get the glare not to go on it, but that's sort of what he looked like later in his life. So in terms of achievements, long-term achievements, Greta re-established the study group, got that going again. She's also shocked to remember Robert Stewart from the start. He came to the first study session completely unannounced. No one knew he was going to come, and said, I've been a Baha'i since 1912. Sign me up. You finally got here. And so he formally declared. I imagine a surprise at like this guy saying, I've been a Baha'i for 30 years, and it's like, well, how? So that was, I guess, a nice send-off, because that was like just when she was leaving. This guy comes to the session and says, yeah, I'm already a Baha'i. Quite an interesting thing. And this is just from the last sort of postscript to her report in the bulletin. It says, and so ends a glorious 3 months adventure in propagating the cause in Brisbane. Sincere thanks are rendered to the NSA for allowing me to serve the faith in this manner. The many friends who have assisted in paving the way to successful action, their remembrance of me in their prayers. That's amazing, I guess, her perspective on the service. She's saying, thank you for allowing me to serve, not you're welcome for all the service I've done, but she's viewing it really as an opportunity rather than an accomplishment. And she also says, above all, this servant bows humbly and most reverently toward him, founder of the Baha'i faith, whose guidance and grace enabled her to overcome all difficulties and obstacles, experience each day manifestations of his supreme power. Really paying tribute to these two concepts of the greater covenant and the lesser covenant in this. I think is interesting. You think of a report, you think of maybe something boring, it's going to be a lot of figures. It's like, I guess her love for the faith was so great, she couldn't help putting in something almost teaching it and deepening on it, even just in a dry kind of report of this is what I did for 3 months. But even there, she's still talking about the spiritual aspects of it. After her departure, Ben Rayner, who we also heard about in the Tasmanian session, She met with him in Sydney when she was sort of meeting with the NSA, and he decided, okay, I'm going to go north as well. And there was another declaration while he was there, bringing the community to 5. They're also supported by Miss M. Rowlings. I'm not sure of what her name is, because in the bulletin they kind of just put the initials a lot of the time. But she visited and gave a talk about Baha'i administration in October 1946. So again, this support for, you have the kind of initial teaching campaign, then also the follow-up support. But unfortunately, Rayner departed. I think he went down to Tasmania. The study group had disbanded again by 1947, so they only really kept it running for about a year. Further challenges, I think this is what the 3rd time they've kind of established a community, and then it's fallen apart a little bit. Also, something that was happening around this time is they were sort of going outside Brisbane as well. So James Heggie, I think he was still in Papua New Guinea in the army, maybe. I'm not sure actually, but he visited Warwick in about middle of 1946. Warwick recently got an LSA, I think, a couple of years ago. This is, I guess, the start of that community, was James Heggie's visit. And Jack Good also visited Rockhampton in 1946 and Cairns in 1948. But these were for his business trips for his bakery association. So I don't know if he taught the faith, but he was a Baha'i kind of going and visiting these places. So who knows what spiritual effect that might have had, even if he wasn't actively teaching. I hope it's been a bit interesting, but there's not many pictures, I know, and maybe it's a bit sort of figures and not so much anecdotes, but hopefully it's something worth hearing. I guess coming now to the divine plan, when Chogi Effendi kind of started systematizing the activities of the Friends. So in 1947, Australia got a 6-year plan and the goal of establishing 7 LSAs. One of the goals the NSA decided was Brisbane. We might as well establish an LSA. We've been working here for years. It's time. But immediately, one of the families that decided, okay, we want to support this goal was the Chittleburras from Adelaide. It was kind of in the bulletin's reading, it's this drama of, the Chittleburras are trying to get their affairs in order. Ultimately, they couldn't secure housing, I think, so they weren't able to make the move. That's sort of the thought that counts, I think, and they were making those efforts, even if they ultimately couldn't achieve it. And Hilda Brooks, who is now, by this time, Hilda Thomas, she'd gotten married, retired from the NSA. She came to Brisbane on holiday and kind of followed up with her contacts from 7 years previously. We see here on the right is one of those talks. Now it's Hilda Thomas giving a talk on the Baha'i way to world unity at the Country Women's Association room. Something I forgot to mention is Clara Dunn also held a lot of meetings in the Country Women's Association room. So that was really one of the very strong relationships for the Baha'is early in Brisbane and in Queensland, was the Country Women's Association. In 1948, Chogi Effendi sent the following cable to the NSA, I believe, saying, "Delighted progress achieved. Let's concentrate immediate efforts, formation assemblies, Brisbane, Perth. All safe, loving appreciation, Chogi." So I guess reminding the Friends, okay, make sure you focus on Brisbane and also Perth as these other 2 capitals which didn't yet have spiritual assemblies. For the same month that this cable came to Australia, it was James and Merle Heggie pioneered to Brisbane. So the Guardian was very fond of James. It's in Merle Heggie's book. I'm not sure, maybe if somebody who knew him personally, maybe it would be better to tell that story, but the Guardian met him on pilgrimage when he was a youth during World War II, because he was stationed in Palestine, so he went on pilgrimage. I'm not sure, is there anybody who'd like to maybe share that story if they know it?
Well, Chris, I was going to invite you later, but Ben's inviting you now to speak about your father's meeting with the Guardian. Do you want to do that briefly now? Have you got a microphone there?
How long have you got? I could give you the very, very quick version, or I could give you the proper one, but it's actually...
Just maybe quick and we can revisit it. Yeah, I'm not sure how we're going for time, really. I haven't timed this.
The very, very quick version is that my father was able to visit Palestine in 1942 as a result of, he volunteered for service in the Australian Medical Corps in Palestine and was able to visit Haifa after 3 or 4 months. He made 2 visits to Haifa. The beloved Guardian granted him pilgrimage in that time, and he visited all the holy sites and the archives. My father was able to make some contributions, and then returned to Australia after the fall of Singapore. So at the end of, towards the end of 1942, he came back to Australia. So, but yeah, there's a very, very long version as well. Not for tonight.
Hoping we have time for some more details later. I'm not sure how long we've even been going for, but I promise it does speed up a bit, because as I've been writing a book, so I've been going very meticulously over all these things. But when we get to the period, I haven't sort of been pouring over in too much detail. It speeds up a bit, I guess, because it's more the overview. So the Guardian was quite fond of
Ben, just a
yes?
time check. You're at the 1 hour mark. We usually go till 9 or 9:15. So you've got about 30 minutes to 45 minutes for the rest of the session.
Okay, so I might try to pick up the pace a bit. This is the what the Guardian wrote to the National Spiritual Assembly after meeting James Heggie. So he spoke very highly of him to the National Spiritual Assembly. I imagine this would have been quite a remarkable experience to have the Guardian writing this about you. But yeah, this is from Merle Heggie's, which I'm sure you can read for yourself. I kind of just put this in because I was doing a presentation for the youth, so to sort of encourage them to read it. So she describes, obviously, that Brisbane seemed a bit tacky compared to Sydney. Where we've seen the photos before, it was kind of all these Queenslander homes with the tin roofs. Their welcome was sort of the person who was staying with raised their rent immediately as soon as they got there, so not the best of welcomes. She talks about the believers. So there were only 3 Bahais when they got there, which was Jack Good, his mother Annie Bedgood, and Robert Stewart. They think that had through this whole time, they've kind of got 3 people who are that kind of core community. And James Heggie became a chiropractor, and he also worked at a factory for Frank and Dorothy Farley, who became Baha'is. In 1949, Guardian sent a cable saying, "Loving appreciation, ardently praying formation Brisbane Assembly." Again, the Guardian praying and really accompanying this small community. This is Merle Heggie's book. I think it's been shown in previous sessions, but it's well worth reading. It's available through the national website for quite cheap. And I would strongly encourage everybody to read this wonderful book. One of the people that supported the Heggies was Joseph Perdue. So he was a very talented speaker. He really widened their contacts that they had in Brisbane, because he was very good at speaking on wide range of topics. So imagine in the past, it was sort of speaking to the Theosophical Society and the New Thought movements. So he was sort of able to speak at a wider scale. They had a breakthrough in 1949. Finally, they had people joining the community wholeheartedly, and they had 6 declarations, which included Frank and Dorothy Farley, who knew James Heggie through his work, the Squelch family, which is Anne Stark's grandparents. This is a photo of Arthur Squelch, who was a train. He worked on trains, so quite a blue-collar, I guess, person. So this is the first LSA of Brisbane. This is the certificate that they have in the Baha'i Centre. I might try to go through it a bit quickly so that we can get discussion and not so much just me talking. And obviously the Guardian was very pleased and sent a congratulations when they'd formed this LSA, finally, after all these years. A surprise addition, we know the goal for Queensland was to contribute to the plan, please establish an assembly. Another goal the NSA had was a certain number of Baha'i groups, which just means less than 9 Baha'is, but still having an organized structure. And so Perdue was regularly visiting Toowoomba and giving talks. Merle Heggie got a job as a piano teacher for 5 weeks. But in 1949, 4 women declared. The Love Ladies, Antoinette, I can't remember her husband's name, pioneered from Sydney to Toowoomba. So they had a surprise group that they hadn't planned for in November in Toowoomba. That's what it looked like at the time. A nice surprise, I guess, for the National Assembly. And this is just a picture of the progress through that plan. So in 1947, obviously only an LSA in Brisbane. And then by the end of the plan, 1950, an LSA and also a group in Toowoomba and an isolated believer up in Townsville. So bit of progress. But these are just some of the early believers who stayed behind, I guess. So what declared in 1950 was Jean Milway, who was a very voted believer for many years. Viva and Jeff Rodwell, who were very prominent. They moved to Sydney in the late 70s. Anna Tweedy, Betty Anderson, who is Elizabeth Heinsohn, MJ Stevens, the Katzmans, who were from Germany and declared about a year after they'd moved to Australia. William Hewitt, the Forests, and Peter Bird. So these are just some of the names that popped up that you maybe people are familiar with. So one of the institutional developments is obviously they established a regional teaching committee after having the LSA. So not getting focused on Brisbane, we're also worried about the rest of Queensland. And it was based more in Toowoomba. If you look at the old bulletins, there's a lot more reports of teaching activity to Toowoomba than Brisbane, actually, even though Brisbane had the LSA. But I imagine one of the reasons is also if nobody's writing to the bulletin in those days, nobody knows what's going on. So maybe Toowoomba just had people who were more willing to write those reports. And in terms of institutional development, as they were established in 1949, they couldn't participate in the National Convention. In 1950, they were given one delegate, but they didn't send someone. I'm not sure why. It might have just been lack of economic resources. But even though they didn't have someone at the convention, James Heggie was re-elected to the NSA. So he was, I guess, the first person in Queensland to serve on the NSA. The following year, they had two delegates, which was James and Merle Heggie. 1952, F. Rodwell was elected as one of the delegates. So I guess the first non-pioneer, somebody actually from Brisbane, to go to the National Convention as a delegate. And just another sort of later milestone, Peter Bird was elected to the NSA in 1957, and I think he would have been the first Queenslander who wasn't a pioneer to serve on the body. So in terms of more institutional development, in 1952, the Brisbane Baha'i community established a youth committee with B. Anderson as the first secretary. The youth activity, always something we love, I guess, in the Baha'i community. It's when that sort of started getting more systematic. Sort of thinking, we're focused a lot on Brisbane, but looking at what was some of the activity outside Brisbane, the more rural areas, up until the 10-year Crusade. So one of those was Kitty Carpenter, which as Rodney Hancock's aunt, I've spoken a lot to, has been very patient of that in the library talking about all these old stories. But she moved to Rockhampton in May of 1949, and she was almost immediately kicked out of Rockhampton for teaching the faith in a hostel. They didn't like that. They said, no, we're kicking you out. And then she pioneered somewhere else. And I think she's a Baha'i. It would be great for somebody to write a biography, because just looking through the bulletin, she was always doing amazing things, pioneering here and there and going to conferences and very fearless, I suppose. Another person was Marjorie Squelch, who's Anne Stark's mother, moved to Cairns in May, and then actually to Port Moresby in 1951. E.W. Handley, I'm not sure of the first name. He moved to Townsville in June, so that's that dot we saw on the map of the isolated believer up in Townsville. And then he moved to Mount Isa in December. 1952, there was a youth who declared he moved to Mount Isa. He left the faith, I think, as being quite isolated from the community, because he declared in 1952, then moved to Mount Isa. You imagine it's hard to keep up your enthusiasm. The Catsmans moved up to Papua New Guinea to Rabaul, I think they weren't so active in the teaching, but they did meet and have with the pioneers, Rodney Hancock and Sister by Hank. William Pruitt, he declared, I think, in 1952 or 1953, and he was from Coonamulla, and his family ran a hotel, so he inherited the hotel and went to Coonamulla. It's quite a remarkably rural area. And he died of a heart attack quite soon after, and is actually, I think, the first Queenslander to have his obituary in the Baha'i Bulletin. So it was almost, I guess, the first Queensland Baha'i to pass away. Just think of how recent it is, 1953. Also, there have been no Baha'is who have passed away before that point. So other things sort of to think about in that period just before the 10-year Crusade. In 1950, Stanley Bolton Sr. visited Toowoomba and did a teaching tour of Queensland. Shirin Fosdar, who's a very outstanding Baha'i, very notable for her work with feminism and work in Singapore and India. So she came and did a bit of a teaching tour, visiting Brisbane, Ipswich, Toowoomba and Southport. And while she was here, she spoke at the Rodwell's home and also the Squelch home to sort of smaller groups. In 1953, we got a visit from a Hand of the Cause. I think this would have been the first visit by a Hand of the Cause while they were actually a Hand of the Cause, because Clara Dunn had come before she was appointed and Keith Ransom Keller was appointed posthumously. Mr. Fazey came, but at this time he was just serving as the interpreter for Mr. Foratan. And so he gave a interview to a local newspaper. I'm hoping Anne Stark is here. She can see maybe after we've gone through the stuff, a really great story about Mr. Fazey and her grandfather. There's just a photo of them at Yarrambul. I think we're quite close to the end, so hopefully it doesn't take too much longer. So in terms of social action, something the House recently released a compilation about, Brisbane started doing that very early in November 1953. Viva Rodwell, who founded a Queensland Society for the Welfare of the Aboriginal Race. So this was a group kind of focused on the indigenous people, not sort of getting taken care of by the government, and also teaching racial toleration among the right race, of trying to encourage that kind of race amity, is I guess what they would have called it in America. And the inaugural board they elected actually had 3 indigenous people serving on it. If you think about 1953, it's quite remarkable, kind of indigenous people actually having their own say on a board of a body for helping them. I think Albert Namatjira, the first person to get full citizenship in 1957, so this was even before that. So I haven't done much research on this, but it's, I think, quite important. It's a very remarkable thing in the history that the Baha'is were doing this, and Viva Rodwell was doing this. I've just got here, this is a book which was published by the Baha'i Publications Australia. It's worth reading. It has an article by Viva Rodwell sort of about the work that she was doing with this, that she's written about it. So that's a good one to follow up. It's called Indigenous Peoples in the Wake of Mabu. That's a good one to read, I think. This is a letter Viva Rodwell got, where the Guardian says to give his greetings to Jim Heggie. So obviously you can see he was very, very fond of him personally. And Messages to the Antipodes, there's a new version coming out, which would be worth picking up when it comes out, just to get these kinds of looks at how the Guardian was supporting the community. This is very quick. I'll just try to run through it. We're basically finished now. I hope it wasn't too boring. But this is just, yesterday I was quickly going through the bulletin to try and get some dot points to share something about during the 10-year crusade. So these are just some dot points of things that happened. So in 1954, the Heggies departed Brisbane, kind of leaving the Queensland community to mature on its own. Ipswich was set as a goal at the start of, we want a Baha'i group in Ipswich. Baha'i named Emily Easy visited in 1955 and went around to some of the things. It got all the way up north to Cairns. 1956, Frank Wiss and Kitty Carpenter came back, visited Brisbane, kind of spoke about their international travels, because they both pioneered as part of the crusade. Peter Bird, who declared that year, gave a talk on the Declaration of the Bab, which was broadcast on the radio quite widely in Brisbane and Darling Downs. And one of the things that they started doing during this time was obviously the outreach to the Indigenous community through the Rodwells, and also actually supporting Asian students, so from India and Far East Asia, who are studying in Queensland and building bonds and holding dinners with them. And that also established a couple of high groups by this time, other than Toowoomba. So 1957, some more developments. There was an isolated believer living in Chess, a small town. Marriott Bolton and a Mrs. Walker, I don't know her first name, I don't know if she's related to John Walker, visited Brisbane. Patricia Pennington pioneered Surfers Paradise. Peter Kahn presented the National Assembly at a state conference. And at that state conference, they consulted and set themselves the goal of establishing an LSA in Toowoomba and Maryborough. And I think Anne Stark has a story to share about her grandmother going to Maryborough, I guess, as a result of this conference. 1958, Enoch Olinga was visiting Pacific, and he visited Brisbane. And by 1958, we'd also gotten isolated believers in Redgate and Meandara. So coming really to the end now, so some miscellaneous items related to the youth and the history. So in late 50s, the Queensland University Baha'i Society was founded, which was quite a notable group in the history of the faith, I think, in terms of youth. This is Robert Patterson, who was one of the founding members. He later pioneered to Samoa. 1976, they had a national youth conference attended by 175. 2013, we had a regional youth conference attended by 550. I guess numbers going up is always good. And this is a very, very incomplete list. This is just things that I've been able to find very quickly researching about an hour before. Just some LSAs and kind of when they were established. So 1961, Ipswich was established. You remember that was one of the goals of the 10-year crusade, so they got it. This is a photo from the World Centre that they sent. On the left is the LSA of Brisbane in 1957. And so really in the 70s and 80s is when we started getting that institutional development further north. So quite recently. And I'm sure there's people who can share about that. Hopefully I haven't taken too much time. This is just a postscript from 1957. The Guardian passed away. He wrote a cable to the Brisbane community saying, "Lighted ashore, loving prayers," which is nice to know. I guess the community was still supporting just this very humble, small community right up until the final year of his life. And this is just my email address because I'm hoping to really expand this research. If you have anything you want to share with me, or you can feel free to send me an email. And that's it, finished. Hopefully it didn't take too long.
Ben, thank you so much for that presentation. It was ridiculous. It was inspiring.
Well done.
Everybody's
It's very well researched, really well done. Best one among all the series that we
Oh, very
Well done. Well
Thank
done,
you.
Ben.
Very
Well
much.
done.
Very well done. Yes, I
Yes.
think it's excellent.
Wonderful.
Very well done.
Very nice presentation.
So good, so good. Thank you.
Well done,
Good.
Ben.
Thank you, friends. That's great. So, look, Ben, are you happy to take? There's some questions, but also I just want to invite a few people to add to that. If everybody could just remain mute, we'll hear from just a few people. Ben's invited others who are part of the community to give some brief recollections. So I'm just wondering if Zore Faizi is able to come online and gives a recollection of Jack Bedgood. And as Stark, if you're able to come on after that.
Yes. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, we actually met Jack Bedgood when we were holding a mind, body and spirit. We used to hold we had a stall, the Bahais had a stall in there, and Nason and I were in the stall, and this lovely gentleman came up and started to look at the prayer books, and we said to him, would you like to have a look at one of these prayer books? He said, I have many Baha'i prayer books, he said. And then we said, oh, really? Who gave them to you? He said, I'm a Baha'i. And he hadn't been in touch with the Baha'i community for many years. And so this was wonderful. And he said, well, I'd like to meet Baha'is and I want to come back. And so we did, you know, obviously we invited him and he came over. And, you know, after that, we realized, you know, how amazing he was, because he was, as Ben has expounded on, such a pivotal person in the establishment of the Baha'i community in Brisbane. And so after that, it was absolutely wonderful, because we would meet with him many times. He would come to our house and he'd tell us stories, and it was absolutely lovely. He actually gave us a lot of original letters that he had received from Haifa, and we've passed them on to the National Assembly. But I also want to mention a lady called Rose. I'm so sorry, I can't remember her surname. Now, Ben, maybe you know of Rose.
Rose Maxwell. Rose Maxwell.
Oh, that's right. Thanks, John. That's right. Rose Maxwell. She was just amazing as well. One of the early believers. And so we would have this, because they both lived in Kenmore, where we were. And so, yeah, really, I mean, I could go on about how wonderful they were and what wonderful times we had. And Farid and Hedy, you remember? Do you remember?
Yes.
Yes.
We were thinking, I hope you are there, because I couldn't remember Rose's surname.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
So it was lovely. And when while we were still there, they passed away while we were still there, but we had such wonderful memories with them. That's it, really.
Now, I think it was Rose's son, Bill Maxwell, that used to come and visit us in Ballarat in the late 1950s. He had an aunt in a hospital there.
Right.
Yes, that'll be right, John. Now, yes.
This is Hedy.
Hedy, go ahead.
Yeah, just in follow-up with what Zora have said in regarding to Jack. I have wonderful memories from Jack, and it was a great pleasure to know him, and I got to know him more even tonight. Thank you, Ben. And Jack, when I started to come back to the Baha'i community, I have a couple of good memories. That one of them, in that time I was the treasurer there, so every Wednesday morning going to the Baha'i Center to sort out the books. Those days was handwritten books and difficult time for treasurers, but and in the evening we had the assembly normally. So one day he came and he said, Hedy, I have a little check to contribute. I said, oh, thank you, Jack, that's wonderful. So I got the check and I went to my office. I started to do the jobs. And he said, Hedy, what can I do for you? I said, well, whatever you want to do. Let's see, go around the Baha'i Center and see what we can find that you want to be busy with. And he said, I like to work on the library, on the books. I said, that's a great job if you do. So that day he started to go through the books, flick them through, and I did my treasury book. And suddenly I wanted to put the checks together and go to the bank. And I saw his checks. I went to Jack. I said, Jack, this, how much do you want to write? This is a big check. He said, yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Don't worry about it. I wanted to contribute that. What do you think I have to contribute to? I said, Jack, we are going to change the Baha'i Center soon. And if you wish, I can put it on the fund for the Baha'i Center, new building fund. He said, oh, that's the best place. Put it there. I said, all right. So that became earmarked money for the new Baha'i Center that we were looking for. And that was one of the first checks that it went to that allocated fund. But anyway, after that, I started to know where he's living. So I was dropping off. The next Wednesday, pick him up to come to the center. And he said, Hedy, I like to do something in the library, in the bookshop. I said, what do you want to do in the library, Jack? He said, I want to write a list, 2 paragraphs or 1 paragraph about every book. And now, I don't know how many books we had those days, but at least over 100. I said, Jack, feel free. I give you a notebook. So I gave him, I don't know how many pages about that notebook. And he started to write down. He was reading a book, write the name of the writer, the date of that, and write a small paragraph about the book. So just to make the longest story short, he said, Hedy, he had a suggestion. He wanted to do something. I can't remember. And I went out to him. I said, Jack, what do you want to do? Just explain to me. Just when he told me, I said, okay, Jack, why you don't do it this way? Just, I said something and said, Hedy, I wondered why I couldn't think of that. And I started to laugh and he laughed. So after that, anytime he was coming to the Baha'i Center, he was hoping that he's going to do some improvement in the Baha'i library that we have. Thanks for your time.
Hedy, thank you for that. We're getting to know so much about Jack Bedgood tonight that we didn't know before. And it's so wonderful to know that there are people who knew him personally to give these recollections. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I do want to ask Anne Stark if you can share some memories of your grandmother or your grandparents and your time in Brisbane.
Well, I don't think I'll talk about my time in Brisbane because it's way beyond 1953. But Graham, I do wanted to say that it was lovely that Zore and Nasan found Jack Bedgood because Mum was delighted to be able to be reunited with him before she ended up coming down here in the last few years of her life down to Hobart. I wanted to just give you a couple of stories about my grandfather.
Excuse me, Anne, before you go on, is there any chance you could come closer to the microphone? Because it's important for us to hear.
Sorry. I'll come and sit here. How about that? But I might just grab a couple of things that I've put together. Ben asked me to tell a story about my grandfather and Mr. Faizi and Mr. Furitan. Because I mentioned that when we were in Haifa, we met up with Mrs. Iran Mahaja, who was Mr. Furitan's daughter, and told her this story. And so I thought it might be interesting. My grandfather was a train driver, and after the war in the Second World War, it was very hard to get cars. You had to and not many people had them. You had to order. In fact, he had this thing called an Austin A40 that he was very proud of, and he had to wait 2 years to get it. So when this very exciting visit of the Hand of the Cause and Mr. Faizi, his translator, was coming, my grandfather Arthur volunteered, I think, to drive them around. So he would drive them to all their meetings. They were staying at Lennon's, which at that stage was at the major hotel in Brisbane and was, for Brisbane residents, it wasn't where Lennon's ended up later on George Street. Lennon's was at the top of the mall in Queen Street, between George Street and Edward, I think. And so my grandfather came time to deliver Mr. Fazey and Mr. Furitan back to the hotel just to say goodbye. And my grandfather was he had originally come from Birmingham in England, and I don't remember him very much. He died about 12 months after we came back to Australia. And this is my grandmother's story, actually, because Mum and I, by that stage, were still in Papua New Guinea. And apparently, in the manner of Persian men, Mr. Fazey and my grandfather, Arthur, had such a common sense of humour that they'd got on like a house on fire. And Mr. Fazey reached out and embraced my grandfather and kissed him on both cheeks, whereupon, in the middle of Brisbane, in the CBD, my grandfather burst into laughter and said, in a very loud voice apparently, "That's the first time I've ever been kissed by a man." And but that was just an example of the love that just began between the two of them after a very short time. A couple of years, well, the next year actually, he became terminally ill and he passed away. And Gertrude Squelch wrote to the Guardian and asked for prayers, which is what they did in those days. You had a family member who needed prayers, you wrote to the Guardian. And the dear Guardian wrote back and assured him of, well, through Rahir Hurabani, Rahir Khanum assured her of the prayers for his recovery, so that they could continue their service together. And the Guardian himself put a postscript, not only prayers for your dear husband, but for the success of your efforts for the promotion of our beloved faith, says the Guardian. Well, he passed away within about a month of that letter being received. And the reason I mention this letter is that Nan then wrote back to the Guardian saying that he passed on and asking for prayers for his soul. And Rahir Khanum wrote back assuring of those prayers. He urges you now, she said, to assist in the establishment of new centres. This work is of the utmost importance and highly meritorious, and will attract to you divine blessings and assistance. And again, the Guardian says, assuring you of my loving and fervent prayers for the progress of the soul of your departed husband, and for all your and for your spiritual advancement, which is the most lovely thing to receive. The loss of her husband affected her deeply, but as Ben pointed out, she took those words of the Guardian to heart, and although she didn't change her residence totally, for the next, I don't know how many, 5, 6, 7 years, I remember regularly going to the train station to either see her off or receive her from coming back, and she would go and stay in Maryborough. Peter Khan visited her there. She took the opportunity to give talks on the radio, and arranged for him to give a talk as well. So those are probably the memories of my grandparents that I'd like to share. There's one more. You mentioned, Ben, an isolated Baha'i in Meandara. Her name, which is way out west, for those of you who are not aware, it's in fact the Meandara isolated Baha'i lived on a sheep station. Her name was Mari Kidd, and in Brisbane after the Second World War, there were many women who had who were seeking for new ideas, and Marjorie, my mum, was one of them, as was Mari, whose maiden name I don't know. but they met up and they met at a lady called Nell Johnson, who was taught interpretive dance in the manner of Isadora Duncan. But also they would go to New Thought lectures together. And then when Mari married and went to live in Meandara, they still wrote to each other, and every 6 months Mari would come down to get the food for the next 6 months for the sheep station for the staff and everything. And they would meet up and, you know, have you found it yet, Marge? Have you found it yet, Mari? They would meet, and one day in 1949, they met up, and it was after Mum had become a Baha'i, and she and Mari met, and she waited to tell Mari until they were face to face because Mari was coming to town, and she said apparently Mari seemed very excited this time when they were sitting down to have their cup of tea together, and Mari said, "Marge, I think I've found it." And she reached down and pulled out of her handbag a newspaper clipping, and it was one of those newspaper clippings that newspaper ads that the Bahais used to put in, such as perhaps Greta had, I found out tonight, Greta had advised against continuing, but and I've got one, this is from 1960, but it's headed Bahais Believe, and it's quite a detailed advertisement, and I found it in Mum's papers after she passed on. Anyway, Mari says, "Marge, I think I've found it," and reaches down, and Mum looks at it and says, "Mari, I am a Baha'i." So the two of them apparently embraced and burst into tears together. So anyway, I'll stop talking and let lots of other people, because I can see Elizabeth Heinsohn is there. Yes, there's the corner of Elizabeth's eye there. And I'm sure Elizabeth's got far more those early years.
We met her as a little kid.
And thank you for that. Elizabeth, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it would be lovely to hear from you. Anything you want to share with the session today? About the Rodwells or your own early... John, I'm just going to mute you. I'm just going to see if Elizabeth's able to join us for a moment. She's... Thank you.
Hello, yes. I did type in a message there about Mr. Squelch, and that just related to the wonderful singing voice that he had. I think Mrs. Squelch would accompany him when he, would delight us on these wonderful occasions. So that's just a lovely story I wanted to convey about Mr. Squelch. You asked about the Rodwells. Well, I don't know where to start there because Viva and Jeff were very active in the community, and goodness knows what you'd like to hear about it. Can you give me a lead there?
Maybe it's a big question to ask and put you on the spot. We could come back to it on another session, perhaps, and put some thoughts together. I just thought that, my understanding is you knew the Rodwells very well. And a lot of people who are listening tonight don't know anything of their character, their interests, their activities. Ben has given a little overview of it, but maybe there was something you might be able to share. But if it's too big a subject, we can leave it for another time.
Yes, well, just trying to be brief, I guess the Rodwells, I became a Baha'i, I think about 6 months after they had declared. And from the very start, they were very, very active in the Brisbane community. Viva in particular, she was a great leader and an initiator. And as you noted, one of the things she initiated, she and Jeff, was this formation of this Aboriginal group, which they started. I think this would have been in the 1960s, when the conditions of people of colour, but also Indigenous people throughout the world was being brought to the fore. And there was a lot of activist groups coming to the fore. This, of course, drew attention to the Rodwells of the situation of Aboriginal people in Brisbane. And of course, me being of mixed race, partly of Indigenous race as well, I guess that might have helped stem the interest there. But one of the people which charmed us all was an elderly gentleman, an Aboriginal gentleman who we knew as Uncle Willie. And he became a really close friend of the Rodwells. But look, I could just tell you that they became involved with in Aboriginal and Island affairs. They became involved in the, they were initiating the first preschool in Yeronga. I think I'll just leave it at that because there's so much I could say that it's a bit difficult to focus.
That's fine, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. Friends, we've come to an hour and a half of this session, and I'd like to, we're just maybe one or two more comments, hopefully from Queenslanders who are online, or any final thoughts from Ben before we end our session tonight.
Graham, can I just say that that Maori Kid's daughter, Adrian, and her son, Mark Jockimson, both live in Toowoomba, and Mark is on the LSA of Toowoomba. He's the vice chairman of the assembly. So, you know, that family has had sort of very effective service to the faith.
Thank you for that, John. And I think that there's room for further sessions concerning Queensland and the Toowoomba community, the Rockhampton, the Townsville, Ipswich, Gold Coast, many more stories to be told.
Have we talked about cosmos?
We have someone else who's got one last comment to make. If not, let's, yes, do you have something, Friday?
Just I wanted to say a little bit about Rose Maxwell. She was an amazing lady, as Zohre June remembers, always immaculately groomed, very chic, coming from nursing home to the Baha'i meetings. And I remember she was telling her story about how she became Baha'i, and during Martha Ruth's trip, she heard somebody is coming to talk about the peace, world peace. And she went with that idea to the meeting of Martha Ruth. And she said, as she started talking, and I heard, oh, she's talking about another religion, I went down to the chair and I was just relaxing to lay down. And as she talks, and I thought, oh, that's very interesting. This is such a different point of views she's talking about. And I sat right in the chair and started to listen. And this is how she got to know about the faith, and then she became a Baha'i. And I remember last time I saw Rose, because we were in the same community, we were giving her right to bring her to the feast and other Baha'i meetings. She was in hospital. Me and Zohre, I'm sure Zohre remembers, we went to see her. That was my last visit to Rose. And even I remember in hospital, she was so nicely manicured and groomed. Always that was always she was looking beautiful. That was really something which I never forget. Lovely lady, lovely lady. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fode. That's a lovely recollection. And I'd like to see a photo of Rose Maxwell. I don't think I've seen one, and we'll look for one to get an idea of this wonderful lady. Now, Mike Day, I'm going to put you on the spot there, being a journalist and quick on your feet. Could you please give a little note of thanks to Ben Perkins for his presentation tonight?
Yes, Graham, I'll be happy to. Ben started researching, I don't know, maybe he first contacted me about 6 months ago, and I thought this was amazing. We have a dynamic young researcher who's finding out all this information that other people have yet to discover and get inspired by. And Ben was using Trove and new techniques of research, and he was coming up with all this fascinating information. We've only heard a summary of Ben tonight. He's got a lot more, and so I thought the person he has to get in touch with was Graham Hassel, and I think Graham, you probably inspired him to continue. I think it's really exciting to have a historian of Ben's caliber starting out on this amazing history, and I'm sure that there's lots more that he will do. And I really think on behalf of everybody, and particularly those who've had a long association with Queensland, unlike me, but I'm sure that they'll be very grateful to hear Ben's mentioning of people that they knew and loved, and to see some of them here tonight. So congratulations, Ben.
Mike, thanks so much for that. And Ben, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for the presentation this evening. It's been wonderful, highly appreciated, and we look forward to further presentations from you in future about your research. Well done tonight. Thank you so much. We'll bring the session to an end now. Thank you.